The late June sun hung low over the suburban sprawl of Westlake, Ohio, a quiet corner on the western edge of Cleveland where the streets were lined with neat lawns and identical colonial homes. The air carried the faint hum of lawn mowers and the sweet aroma of charcoal grills being fired up for weekend barbecues. At 214 Maplewood Drive, a modest two-story house with pale blue siding and a wraparound porch stood like a testament to one family's history, its white picket fence gleaming in the golden light. Inside, Jack Wilson, 28, and his wife, Emily, 27, were trying to master the delicate rhythm of their first year of marriage, a dance that felt both familiar and foreign in the house Jack had inherited from his father. The house was more than a gift, it was a legacy. Jack's father, Tom Wilson, a rugged Vietnam veteran with a love of John Wayne movies and hand-rolled cigarettes, poured his heart into building the house in the late 70s. Every nail, every shingle, was a labor of love for his late wife, Margaret, who had dreamed of raising a family in a home that felt like a sanctuary. Tom finished it just in time for Jack's birth, and though Margaret passed away when Jack was just 6, the house remained a living monument to her memory. When Tom handed Jack the keys on their wedding day, his eyes clouded with bourbon and pride. He said, "This is your home now, son. Build something good in it, like I did." Jack and Emily moved in the day after their honeymoon, their hands full of cardboard boxes and their hearts full of hope. The wedding, held in a rustic barn outside Akron, was a whirlwind of laughter, twinkling lights, and too much champagne. Emily, resplendent in a lace dress that hugged her slender frame, danced barefoot with Jack to Bruce Springsteen's Thunder Road, her brown hair catching the light from the lanterns strung overhead. Jack, with his easy smile and wild dark hair, whispered promises in her ear as they swayed promises of adventure, of kids running in the backyard, of a life that would never be boring. The guests, a mix of Jack's old high school friends and Emily's artistic friends from Oberlin College, toasted their future, clinking glasses under the starry Ohio sky. That night, as they stumbled into their hotel room, drunk on love and Pinot Noir, Emily grabbed Jack's hand and said, "We're going to make this house ours, Jack. Our history, our colors, our everything." He kissed her deeply, believing every word. Now, a year later, the house was definitely theirs, though not always how they'd imagined it. The living room, once Tom's realm of plaid chairs and wood paneling, was now a soft palette of creams and grays, thanks to Emily's eye for design. She'd spent months scouring thrift stores and Etsy for the perfect mid-century coffee table and framed botanical prints, transforming the space into something that could have graced the pages of Kinfolk magazine. The kitchen, with its avocado green cabinets left over from the 80s, was still in the process of being updated, but Emily had painted the walls a sunny yellow and hung a chalkboard where she wrote out shopping lists and drew little hearts. Jack had taken on the backyard, taming the overgrown lawn and building a fire pit where they roasted marshmallows on warm summer nights. But beneath the fresh paint and carefully chosen decor, the house held echoes of its past. Tom's old toolbox still sat in the garage, its rusty hinges creaking as Jack opened it to fix a leaky faucet. Margaret's faded recipe cards, written in her sprawling hand, had been found by Emily in a drawer in the kitchen one rainy day while she was looking for a spatula, and in the hallway upstairs, a faint pencil mark on the doorframe marked Jack's height at age 10, a relic from when his father had still been his hero and his mother's laughter filled the rooms. Living in Tom's house wasn't always easy. Jack, an auto mechanic at a local shop, felt the weight of his father's legacy every time he walked through the front door. Tom, now retired and living in a small apartment in Parma, often dropped by unannounced, bringing a six-pack of Miller Lite and stories of the good old days. He'd point out the beams he'd installed in the dining room or the oak tree he'd planted in the yard, his voice thick with nostalgia. Jack loved his father, but the constant reminders of the house's history made it hard to feel like it was truly his. He found himself wondering if he was living up to Tom's expectations, if he was building the life his father had imagined. Emily, an elementary school art teacher with a quiet intensity that drew people to her, felt the house's history differently. She loved its quirks, the creaky floor in the hallway, the way morning light spilled through the bay window in the living room, but sometimes she felt like an outsider to its history. She'd grown up in a cramped Toledo apartment, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse. The idea of inheriting a house steeped in family lore was both exciting and terrifying. She wanted to honor Tom's gift, but she also wanted to create her own space so that the house reflected who she and Jack were together. For the first few months, they threw themselves into making the house their own. They spent weekends sanding old furniture, arguing cheerfully about paint colors, and making love on the spare room mattress because they were too tired to go up to the bedroom. They hosted barbecues for friends, the backyard filled with the clink of beer bottles and the sound of Jack's acoustic guitar. Emily started a small vegetable garden, her hands covered in soil as she planted tomatoes and basil, dreaming of summer salads they would eat on the porch. Jack built a bookcase in the study, filling it with Emily's art books and his collection of dog-eared science fiction paperbacks. But as the seasons changed, the initial rush of novelty began to fade. The house, once a canvas for their dreams, began to feel like a responsibility. The roof needed repair after a severe winter storm, and the old boiler in the basement hummed ominously. Jack, always handy, spent his evenings tinkering with pipes and wires, his knuckles raw and his patience frayed. Emily, swamped with grading papers and planning lessons, was too tired to cook dinner at night, much less tend the garden. The chalkboard in the kitchen, once a place for playful love notes, now contained a to-do list that never seemed to get smaller. And there were even quieter changes, the ones they didn't talk about. Jack, who'd once easily wrapped his arms around Emily to dance with her in the living room, now spent more time in the garage, tinkering with his motorcycle or scrolling through his phone. Emily, who'd always been the initiator of deep conversations, was increasingly lost in her sketchbook, her pencil drawing lines that seemed truer than words. They still loved each other, there was no doubt about that, but the easy intimacy of their early days had given way to something more complex, a web of unspoken frustrations and unarticulated needs. They didn't fight often. Jack and Emily were too even-tempered to yell, but the silences between them grew heavier, punctuated by small, careless moments that hurt more than they should have. Like the time Jack forgot to pick up the dry cleaning, leaving Emily in a panic to find a clean dress for a school event. Or the night Emily spent hours making lasagna and Jack came home late from the shop, too tired to say more than a mumbled "thank you" before collapsing on the couch. They brushed these moments aside with a laugh, smoothing them over with a kiss or a joke, but each one left a tiny crack in the foundation of their marriage. The wedding memories, once so vivid, now seemed like scenes from someone else's life. Emily sometimes pulled out their photo album, flipping through pictures of Jack feeding her cake, of her tossing a bouquet into a crowd of giggling bridesmaids. She smiled, but there was an ache in her chest, a question she couldn't quite put her finger on. Where had that lightness gone? Jack felt the distance too, though he thought about it less often. He caught himself looking at Emily reading on the porch, her brow furrowed in concentration, and wondered when they had stopped talking about the big things, their dreams, their fears, the lives they wanted to build. One Saturday afternoon, as the summer heat settled over Westlake, Jack was in the garage, his hands greasy from working on his motorcycle. Tom Petty's American Girl was playing hoarsely on the radio, and he was humming along, trying to ignore the pain in his shoulders. Emily was inside, sorting through a box of old letters they'd found in the attic correspondence between Tom and Margaret during his time in Vietnam. The words, written in Tom's firm hand, were honest and open, full of longing and hope. Emily felt her eyes well up as she read. She wondered if she and Jack would ever create something this lasting, this real. She walked out into the garage, clutching the letters in her hand. "Jack," she said, her voice soft but insistent, "can I talk?" He looked up, wiping his hands with a rag, his brown eyes studying her. "Sure, Em. What happened?" She hesitated, looking at the letters, then back at him. "I found these letters. From your father to your mother. They're beautiful. It made me think about us. About home. About what we're building here." Jack's expression softened, but a hint of worry flickered in his eyes. "Yeah, what are you thinking?" Emily took a deep breath, and her words came out in a stream. "I love this house, Jack. I love you. But sometimes it feels like we're just walking in a rut, like we're living your dad's story instead of writing our own. I don't know how to explain it, but I want us to be like that." She held up the letters. "So honest, so open. I want us to talk about the hard stuff, not just paint colors or bills." Jack leaned against the workbench, his jaw tense. He wanted to say something soothing, to hold her and make it all right. But the truth was, he felt it, to the distance, the quiet erosion of their connection. And standing there in the garage, still smelling faintly of his father's cigarettes, he realized that the house wasn't just a gift. It was a challenge, a question. Could they build something as lasting as Tom and Margaret? He said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I'm doing this right, the marriage, the house, all of this. But I know I want to try. With you. Let's figure it out together, okay?" She nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. They stood there for a moment, the radio crackling between them, the weight of their shared history and uncertain future hanging in the air. It was not a grand gesture, not the stuff of wedding toasts or love songs. But it was a small, stubborn step toward reclaiming the lightness they had lost, toward building a love that could fill the rooms of the home they called their own. Summer in Westlake, Ohio, was slow as molasses, with long days drenched in heat and the smell of cut grass. In the house at 214 Maplewood Drive, Jack and Emily were trying to find balance in their first year of marriage, balancing their love with the quiet cracks that were beginning to show in their relationship. The conversation in the garage, with Emily holding Tom and Margaret's letters, felt like a step toward something new, toward the honesty they had been missing. But life, as it often does, had other plans, and in early July, under a merciless sky, their world was turned upside down. Tom Wilson died on Tuesday morning. It was as sudden as lightning on a clear day. A heart attack, the doctors said, sometime between his morning coffee and his attempt to fix an old radio in his apartment in Parma. A neighbor found him on the floor, screwdriver in hand, his eyes, always so alert, staring into space. Jack got the call from the hospital while he was in the shop, elbow deep in motor oil, taking apart the engine of an old Ford. The nurse's voice was smooth, professional, but the words cut through it like a knife. "Your father. We're so sorry. We did everything we could." Jack didn't remember getting to the hospital. The road was a blur of red lights, honking horns, heat clinging to his skin. When he walked into the room, Tom was lying in a hospital bed, his face gray, his arms, once so strong, now lifeless on the sheets. Jack stood frozen, unable to comprehend that the man who had taught him how to tie a tie, fix a bike, and keep his word would never get up again. He didn't cry, not then. He just watched, feeling something inside him tightening, like a spring about to snap. Emily found out when she came home from school, where she was preparing her class for a children's art show. Jack was sitting in the kitchen, staring at a bottle of beer he hadn't even opened. His face was blank, like a blank sheet, but his eyes were stormy. She dropped her bag on the floor and hugged him, her arms tight around his shoulders, as if they could keep him from falling over the edge. "Jack, honey, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice shaking. He nodded but didn't answer, his fingers unconsciously fiddling with the label on the bottle. The next few days were a blur. Jack took a leave of absence from the shop, and he and Emily threw themselves into the funeral arrangements. Tom, a simple, straightforward man, had left no will or wishes, but Jack knew what his father would have wanted. Nothing fancy, just a farewell to those who knew him. They decided on a small ceremony at the local Methodist church, where Tom sometimes showed up at Christmas, more out of respect for Margaret than faith. Emily took charge of the calls to relatives and friends, her voice soft but firm as she explained, reassured, negotiated. Jack, by contrast, was tight-lipped, giving monosyllables when pressed for details. He insisted that Tom be buried next to Margaret in Rocky River Cemetery under the very oak tree his mother had loved so much. There was a small crowd at the funeral. Tom's old Army friends, a few neighbors, a couple of distant relatives from Cincinnati. Jack stood by the casket, his dark suit a little tight in the shoulders, his tie tied with Emily's help like a noose. He shook hands, accepted condolences, but his mind was elsewhere in memories of fishing on Lake Erie, when Tom taught him how to bait a worm, or of nights watching old westerns, Tom chuckling at the pompous lines. Emily stayed close, her hand on his elbow, an anchor in the sea of his grief. But even her warmth couldn't penetrate the wall Jack had begun to build around himself. After the funeral, they returned home to a house that now seemed even more infused with Tom's presence. His scent, a mix of tobacco and Old Spice cologne, still lingered in the garage where his old toolbox sat. Emily tried to keep things in order, cooking meals that Jack barely touched and filling the silence with stories about school or plans to renovate the kitchen. But Jack was retreating deeper into himself. He spent hours in the garage, not so much working on the bike as simply sitting, staring into space, clutching a bottle of whiskey he'd found in Tom's closet. The first bottle had arrived a week after the funeral, a cheap bourbon bought at a local store. He drank not for pleasure, but to numb the pain that seemed to have taken up residence in his chest like an uninvited guest. Emily noticed the change, but at first she didn't know how to react. She watched Jack, always so open and easygoing, become a shadow of his former self. His laughter, which had once filled the house, was gone, replaced by short, sharp replies or silence altogether. He stopped playing his guitar, stopped singing along to the radio stations they loved to listen to together. Even their evening walks around the block, holding hands and chatting about trivialities, ceased. Jack would come home from the shop, take off his work clothes, and head straight to the garage, where the bottle became his companion. Emily tried to reach out to him. One night, 2 weeks after the funeral, she found him sitting in the living room in the dark, an empty glass in his hand. The television was off, and the only sound was the distant barking of a neighbor's dog. She knelt down next to him, her knees touching his, and put her hand on his shoulder. "Jack, talk to me," she said, her voice soft but with a hint of desperation. "I know you're hurting, but you're not alone. I'm here." He looked at her, his eyes clouded with alcohol and grief. "I'm okay, Em," he mumbled, looking away. "Just give me time." But time only seemed to make things worse. The bourbon gave way to stronger whiskey, and soon there was a second bottle in the garage, then a third. Jack didn't drink every day, but he drank often enough that Emily began to notice empty bottles in the trash. She tried to talk to him, but every conversation ended the same way. He brushed it off, assuring her that it's all under control, or he retreated to the garage, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Emily felt anger building inside her, not a bright, explosive anger, but a slow, smoldering anger, like embers she couldn't put out. She was angry not just at Jack, but at herself for not knowing how to help him, for making their marriage, which was supposed to be their sanctuary, feel like a cage. One night in early August, the tension reached its breaking point. Emily came home from a long day at school, where she had been preparing a new watercolor project for her students. She was exhausted but full of ideas, and she wanted to share them with Jack, as they had done before. But when she walked into the house, she found him on the couch, another bottle in his hand, his eyes half closed, the television flashing pickup truck commercials. The smell of whiskey hung in the air, heavy and sharp. "Jack," she said, her voice firmer than usual, "this is too much. You can't go on like this." He turned his head slowly, his eyes cloudy, but with a flicker of irritation. "What do you want me to do, Em? He's dead. My dad's dead. Do you have any idea what that's like?" Her face flushed, and she clenched her fists. "Don't you dare tell me I don't understand. I lost him too, Jack. He was family. But I'm not drowning in a bottle to cope. I'm trying to be here for us, and you just disappear." Jack stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over the bottle. "I'm not disappearing. I just... Shit, Emily, I need space. You can't just fix this with your talking and your damn plan board." The words hit her like a slap. She took a step back, her eyes filling with tears, but she refused to let them spill. "Okay," she said quietly, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. "Take your space, but don't expect me to sit by and watch you destroy yourself and us." She turned and walked into the bedroom, slamming the door so hard the frames on the wall shook. Jack stood there, his breathing heavy, his heart pounding. He wanted to follow her, to tell her he was sorry, but his feet were rooted to the floor. Instead, he grabbed the bottle and took another swig, the bitter taste mingling with his guilt. The next morning, Emily left for school early, leaving a note on the kitchen table. "I love you, but I need you to try. Please." Jack found it while he was drinking coffee, his head pounding from a hangover. He clutched the note in his hand, feeling Emily's words like splinters. He knew she was right. He knew he was drowning. But the pain of losing his father was like a shadow that followed him everywhere, and the whiskey made it less sharp, if only for a moment. The house, once full of their laughter and plans, now seemed too big, too quiet. Tom's letters to Margaret, which Emily had found last month, still sat on the coffee table, their edges beginning to curl. Jack glanced at them sometimes, but he couldn't bring himself to read them. They were a reminder of the love his parents had built, the life he had promised Emily. But now he felt further from that promise than ever. Emily, back home that night, began drawing in her sketchbook, her lines sharp, almost angry. She tried to focus on the colors, the texture of the paper, but her thoughts kept returning to Jack, to their fight, to the gulf that was growing between them. She wanted to reach out to him, to bring back the man who had sung to her with his guitar and made plans for the future. But the anger she had suppressed was now mingling with her grief, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep them both at bay. Jack stood in the garage, looking at Tom's old toolbox, feeling his father still lingering in every corner of the house. He opened it, finding a pack of the cigarettes Tom had smoked and an old pocket knife. He clutched the knife in his hand, its cold metal an anchor in his shaky world. He wanted to be the man Emily loved, the father his unborn child deserved. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Tom's face, and the bottle called to him, promising silence, however temporary. August in Westlake, Ohio, was stiflingly hot, with humidity that clung to one's skin like a wet blanket. In the blue siding, white picket house on Maplewood Drive, the air inside felt even heavier, thick with tension and unspoken words. The death of Jack's father, Tom, had left a void that seemed to suck away everything that was good in the young couple's lives. The conversation in the garage, when Emily had tried to reach out to her husband, had been a brief glimmer of hope, quickly extinguished by the weight of his grief. Now, by mid-August, their marriage, once so full of dreams, was beginning to lose its rhythm, like a record stuck on an old record player. Jack, once a dynamic mechanic with agile hands and an easy smile, was now a shadow of his former self. The pain of losing his father was eating away at him like rust, and the whiskey he drank to drown it was his constant companion. He was not a drunk in the classic sense. He did not drink himself into oblivion. He did not get rowdy. But his daily breaks with a bottle, often in the middle of the day, became a ritual. He would sit in the garage on an old stool, clutching a glass while the sun crawled across the sky and time dissolved into an amber haze. An hour and a half, sometimes two, would be spent drowning out thoughts of Tom, of home, of what he was supposed to be. His appearance began to reflect his inner decay. Jack, who had always kept himself in shape by working in the shop and taking occasional jogs around the block, was now rapidly gaining weight. His once toned frame had softened, his shirts were straining over his stomach, and his face, framed by a week's worth of stubble, looked tired and older. He had stopped shaving regularly, and the dark stubble, sprinkled with premature gray, gave him the appearance of a man who had given up. His eyes, once sparkling with mischief, were now dull, glazed with fatigue and whiskey. Emily noticed these changes with growing alarm, but her attempts to speak to him were met with silence or irritation. She still loved him, a love as deep and ingrained as the oak tree in the yard, but her patience was wearing thin. She spent her days at school teaching children watercolors, helping them find joy in the strokes of a brush, but she returned home to a silence that was louder than words. Her sketchbook, once full of bright sketches of flowers and landscapes, was now filled with angular, chaotic lines, reflecting her own confusion. Misfortune, as it often does, did not come alone. On a Friday in late August, Jack suffered a blow that finally knocked the wind out from under him. He was called into the office of the shop's owner, Ray, a man with rough hands and an even rougher disposition. Ray, who had been in the auto business for 30 years, was not one to tolerate weakness. Jack, despite his talent with engines, had become unreliable in recent weeks. He was late for work, sometimes an hour, sometimes more, citing traffic or insomnia. Several times he missed shifts without warning, leaving colleagues to deal with customers. And the smell of alcohol, which he tried to mask with gum and cologne, was impossible to ignore. "Jack, you're a good guy, and you've got gold in your hands," Ray began, sitting behind a paper-strewn desk in a cramped office. His voice was low but firm. "But I can't keep a guy who doesn't show up on time and smells like a bar. Customers complain, guys get mad. I'm sorry, but you're fired." Jack sat across from him, his fingers gripping the arms of his chair. He wanted to protest, to explain that this was temporary, that he could handle it, but the words caught in his throat. He knew Ray was right. He had let everyone down, not just his boss, but the coworkers who had covered for him when he was late, the customers who trusted him with their cars. He nodded, muttered something unintelligible, and walked out of the office, feeling the ground shift beneath his feet. The shop keys he had handed over jingled in Ray's hand, a final farewell to a part of his life. Emily was still at school when he got home. The house was silent except for the creak of his footsteps on the floorboards. He threw his jacket on the couch and headed straight for the garage, where a half-empty bottle of bourbon sat. He poured himself a glass, neat, and sat on a stool, looking at his father's old toolbox. Getting fired wasn't just losing his job, it was further proof that he was failing, that he wasn't the man Tom thought he was or Emily wanted him to be. By the time Emily got home, Jack was already halfway to oblivion. She found him in the garage, hunched over a workbench, drink in hand. The smell of alcohol hit her before she even entered. Her face tightened, but she forced herself to speak calmly. "Jack, what's wrong? You're home early." He looked up, his eyes cloudy, but with a hint of shame. "I got fired," he said, his voice hoarse. "Ray said I was unreliable, and he's right." Emily froze, her bag sliding off her shoulder to the floor. She knew he was struggling, but being fired, it was like a punch to the solar plexus. She crouched down across from him, trying to catch his eye. "Why didn't you tell me it was that bad? We could have done something, talked to Ray, found a way." "What way, Em?" he snapped, his voice harsher than he'd intended. "I screwed up. I was late, I missed shifts. They couldn't keep me, and I don't blame them." She pressed her lips together, feeling the anger she'd been suppressing for so long begin to bubble up. "You don't blame them? What about us, Jack? I work, I try to keep this house in order, and you just sit here and drink. You're not even trying." He slammed the glass down on the workbench, causing the liquid to slosh over the edge. "You think I'm not trying? You think I like being like this? My dad's dead, Em. My job's gone. What's left for me?" Her eyes flashed, and she stood, her voice shaking with pent-up emotion. "You still have me, Jack. You still have us. But you can't see that. You're too busy drowning yourself in this." She pointed at the bottle, her hand shaking. "I can't keep being the one holding everything together while you fall apart." He looked at her, his face a mixture of pain and anger. Part of him wanted to apologize, to hug her, to promise that he would change. But the other part of him, the part that was soaked in whiskey and grief, couldn't find the words. He simply shook his head and turned away, leaving her standing in the garage doorway, her silhouette outlined in the dim light of the sunset. Emily walked into the house, her steps heavy, as if each one required effort. She sat at the kitchen table, her fingers playing with the edge of the tablecloth she'd bought at a flea market last summer. Her thoughts swirled like leaves in the autumn wind. She remembered their wedding, their dance under the stars, their dreams for the future. Those memories seemed distant now, like an old movie she'd watched as a child. She wanted to save Jack, to save their marriage, but she didn't know how. And worst of all, she was beginning to wonder if he even wanted to be saved. Meanwhile, Jack remained in the garage, his fingers gripping the glass so tightly his knuckles were white. He knew he had failed her. He knew he had failed his father, whose home, whose life, now seemed like a burden he could no longer bear. Being fired wasn't just the end of a job. It was the end of a part of himself, the part that was defined by his ability to fix, to build, to be useful. Without it, he felt lost, like a ship without a rudder. The days after his dismissal had become a blur. Jack had lost track of time, his daily routine now determined not by shifts at the shop, but by the moments when he could steal an hour or two with a bottle. He never left the house except to get another bottle at the corner store, where the cashier, an older woman with kind eyes, began to look at him with pity. His clothes' old t-shirts and jeans were wrinkled, smelling of sweat and whiskey. He had stopped shaving altogether, and his stubble had turned into an unkempt beard that made him almost unrecognizable. Emily, on the other hand, threw herself into her work with even greater fervor. Her classes became a refuge, a place where she could exert some control. She spent hours helping her children create collages of autumn leaves or painting bright landscapes that contrasted with the drabness of her home life. But even at school, she couldn't escape her thoughts entirely. Coworkers noticed her fatigue, the dark circles under her eyes that she tried to hide with makeup. One day, a friend, a math teacher named Sarah, pulled her aside during lunch. "Emily, are you okay? You look, I don't know, I'm exhausted." Emily forced a smile, but it was as fragile as glass. "Just a lot to do at home," she lied, not wanting to reveal the truth. She didn't want to be pitied, didn't want to admit how bad things had gotten. At home, she tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. She cooked dinners, though Jack rarely touched them, leaving the plates untouched on the table. She cleaned the house, dusting the shelves, watering the withering garden that had once been her pride. But every night, when she went to bed and Jack remained downstairs, in the garage, or on the couch, she felt her heart tighten. She began sleeping on the edge of the bed, as if physical distance could protect her from the pain. One evening, Emily decided to try again. She found Jack in the living room, staring at the blank TV, the bottle on the coffee table next to Tom and Margaret's letters. She sat down next to him, her hands folded in her lap, as if she were afraid they would betray her agitation. "Jack," she began quietly, "I don't want us to lose everything we had. But I can't go on like this. We need help. Maybe we should talk to someone, a therapist, or, I don't know, a support group." He looked at her, his face unreadable. "A therapist? Seriously, Em? Do you think I'm some kind of psycho who needs to vent to a stranger?" "It's not that you're crazy," she countered, her voice sharpening. "It's that you're drowning, and I can't pull you out alone. I'm tired of being the only one fighting for us." He snorted, leaning back against the couch. "Maybe you should stop fighting. Maybe that's just who I am." Her eyes widened, and for a moment she thought he was serious. But then she saw the pain in his gaze, a shadow of the Jack she loved, and her anger turned to despair. "You're not like that," she said, her voice breaking. "You're the man who built me shelves, who danced with me in the rain. I know you're still out there, somewhere, but you have to want to come back." He didn't answer, just stared at the floor, his fingers gripping the edge of the couch. Emily waited, hoping for some sign that he'd heard her. But the silence was deafening, and eventually she stood up and walked into the bedroom, her footsteps echoing in the empty house. Jack was alone, his thoughts spinning like the whiskey in his glass. He knew he was losing her, losing himself. But the pain that had settled inside him since his father's death was stronger than his will to fight. He reached for the bottle, but stopped, his hand hovering in midair. For the first time in weeks, he wondered if he could stop, if he could find his way back to the life he had promised Emily. He had no answer, but in that moment, in the silence of a house that had once been full of love, he felt a tiny glimmer of Hope Week as a distant star, but real nonetheless. September in Westlake, Ohio, brought the first hints of fall. The leaves on the maple trees along Maplewood Drive were turning yellow, and the evenings were cooler, with a hint of rain in the air. But in the blue siding, white picket house, where Jack and Emily were trying to keep their marriage afloat, the warmth of summer was long gone. replaced by a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The death of Jack's father, his dismissal, and his deepening habit of drowning their pain in whiskey had transformed their home from a refuge into a battleground, where every day was a struggle not to lose each other completely. Emily, exhausted from trying to reach her husband, felt her hope fading like a candle burning out in the night. She could still see him as the man she had loved, with his easy smile and kind eyes, but he was becoming more and more of a stranger, dissolving into the bottle and his own grief. Jack, for his part, was like a man lost in a labyrinth, not knowing how to find his way out. His life, once clearly defined by work, love, and dreams, was now a blur, with the glass in his hand as his only guide. By mid-September, their marriage was teetering on the edge. Emily would come home from long days at school trying to inspire the students to find Jack in one of two situations, either in the garage with a bottle and a bleary eye, or on the couch, staring into space. His once tidy appearance had given way to complete disarray, and unkempt beard, rumpled clothes, the smell of whiskey that seemed to permeate everything. She tried to talk to him, offered to help, begged, but every conversation ended with either silence from him or a tantrum followed by another bottle. One Friday night, as the skies over Westlake grew heavy with clouds, Emily sat at the kitchen table, her fingers fiddling nervously with the edge of the old tablecloth. She had just finished cooking dinner, baked chicken and potatoes, a dish Jack had once loved, but the plates were untouched. He had not been home by 6 as he had promised, nor had he even returned her text. The clock ticked, each stroke adding to her anxiety, until finally, at 9:30, the front door creaked. Jack stumbled into the house, his steps unsteady and his eyes bloodshot from the alcohol. He threw his keys on the table by the door, not noticing when they slid to the floor. The smell of whiskey hit Emily like a slap before he even entered the kitchen. She stood up, her hands clenched into fists, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice quiet, but with a ring of steel. He shrugged, leaning against the doorframe to steady himself. "At the bar with the guys. Lost track of time." Lost track of time? Her voice rose, shaking with anger. "You promised to be home for dinner, Jack. I waited for you for 3 hours. 3 hours while you got drunk in some bar instead of being here with me." He rolled his eyes, his movements sluggish but irritated. "Relax, Em. It was just an evening. I needed a break." Distraction. She took a step toward him, her eyes blazing. "You think this is just one night? This is every night, Jack. Every damn day you choose the bottle over us. I'm tired, you know. This can't go on." He stared at her, his expression a mixture of guilt and stubbornness. "You think I have it easy? My dad's dead. My job's gone. I'm trying, Em, but you just don't understand." Her face went pale, and she took another step forward, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Don't you dare say I don't understand. I lost him too. I lost the job you loved because you stopped trying. But I'm not hiding in a bottle. I'm here, fighting for us, and you've become nothing." The word hung in the air, sharp and venomous as a knife. Jack froze, his eyes widening as if she'd stabbed him. For a moment, Emily regretted her words, but the anger that had been building for months was too strong to back down. She pointed to the door, her hand shaking. "Get your things together and leave. You're nothing, and you can't afford this house." Jack looked at her, his breathing heavy, his face twisted in pain and anger. He wanted to argue, to say something that would take it all back, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he turned and headed for the stairs, his steps heavy and unsteady. Emily remained in the kitchen, her chest heaving as the tears she had been holding back finally spilled out. She hated herself for saying those words, but she hated him even more for driving her to this point. Half an hour later, Jack came downstairs with a battered gym bag into which he had thrown a few t-shirts, jeans, and a toothbrush. Emily was standing by the door, her arms crossed, her eyes red from crying. Next to her was an old suitcase she had pulled out of the closet, the same one they had taken on their honeymoon. She wasn't looking at him, her gaze fixed on the floor, as if she was afraid that she would meet his eyes and lose her resolve. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice hoarse, almost pleading. She nodded, still not looking up. "I can't do this anymore, Jack. I tried. I really did. But I can't watch you destroy yourself and us. Go away." He gripped the handle of his bag, his knuckles white. It had started to rain outside, the drops pounding the roof like a drumbeat. He opened the door and cold air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of wet earth. "Where should I go?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Emily finally looked at him, her eyes full of pain, but also determination. "I don't know, but not here. Not now." He stepped through the door, and the door closed behind him with a soft click that echoed in the empty house. The rain came down harder, soaking his t-shirt as he stood on the porch, looking out at the street that suddenly felt foreign. He slung his bag over his shoulder and walked away, his boots slapping on the wet pavement, the rain washing away his footprints. Emily stood by the door, her hand still clutching the knob. She waited for the sound of his footsteps coming back, the knock on the door, his voice begging her to reconsider. But all she heard was the rain, unrelenting and cold. She sank slowly to the floor, her back pressed against the door, and gave in to the tears she had held back for too long. She felt as if she had lost not only Jack, but a part of herself, the part that believed in their love, in their future. Jack walked down Maplewood Drive, his clothes soaking wet and his bag weighing down his shoulder. Rain poured down his face, mixing with salty tears. He didn't even realize he was crying. He didn't know where he was going. He had no plan, no place to hide, except maybe the bar on the corner, and even the thought of another drink made him feel sick. He stopped under a street lamp, its yellow light reflecting off the puddles, and looked back at the house, which was now just a dark silhouette in the distance. It had been his father's house, his childhood home, the home he had promised Emily would make his, and now he was cast out like an outsider. He thought of Emily's words, "You've become nothing." They burned like hot iron, but he couldn't deny that they were true. He saw what he had become, a man who had lost his job, who had lost himself, who had lost the woman who had been his anchor. But beneath the pain and the shame, there was a spark, faint, almost invisible, but still alive. He didn't want to be like that. He wanted to be the man Emily loved, the man his father respected. But he didn't know how to get back to that man. Jack walked to the end of the street and stopped at a bus stop, where the bench was wet from the rain. He sat down, ignoring the cold that soaked his clothes. He had his phone in his pocket, but he didn't know who to call. He had friends, but no one he could visit in this state, in the middle of the night, without an explanation. He thought about Emily's mother in Toledo, but pushed the thought aside. He couldn't ask her for help after he'd failed her daughter. In the end, he just sat there, watching the rain run down the glass of the bus stop, his thoughts as murky as the night around him. Emily, meanwhile, had picked herself up off the floor and walked into the living room. She looked at the suitcase still by the door and felt her heart clench. She didn't want this. She didn't want to send him away. She didn't want to see him walk out into the rain. But she couldn't live in the shadow of his pain any longer. She couldn't be the only one fighting for their marriage. She walked over to the coffee table where Tom and Margaret's letters lay and picked one up, her fingers shaking as she unfolded the fragile paper. Tom's words, written decades ago, were full of love and hope, despite the war and the distance. She wondered if she could be as strong as Margaret, if she could wait, if she could believe, if she could fight. She went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, she lay there, listening to the rain pounding the windows and thinking about Jack, where he was, how he was feeling. She wanted to believe that he would find his way back, that they could start over. But deep down, she was afraid that this evening had become a point of no return. Jack, sitting at the bus stop, pulled out an old folding knife from his father's toolbox. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of the metal. It's a cold reality. The knife was simple, unadorned, but it was a part of Tom, a part of the man who had never given up, despite the pain and loss. Jack clutched it in his hand, as if it could give him his father's strength. He didn't know what to do next, but for the first time in months, he felt he had to try. Not for Emily, not for the house, but for himself, for the man he could still become. The rain continued to fall, washing away the dust from the streets of Westlake, but not washing away the pain that bound Jack and Emily together, even now that they were apart. Their love, once vibrant and full of life, was battered but not destroyed. And in this cold, wet night, weighed down by their mistakes and losses, they both stood on the threshold of something new, not a happy ending, but perhaps the beginning of a path to healing. The rain that had driven Jack from his house on Maplewood Drive continued all night, turning the streets of Westlake into mirrors that reflected the dim light of the streetlights. With a sodden gym bag over his shoulder and his father's switchblade in his pocket, he trudged along the wet pavement until he reached a bus stop, where the cold and loneliness finally forced him to make a decision. He had no friends to knock on at this hour, and no money for a motel. That left one option: Megan, his older sister, who lived in nearby Lakewood, 10 miles away. He hadn't called her ahead of time, afraid she would say no if she saw what he had become. But there was no choice, and with gritted teeth, he boarded a night bus that took him through the sleeping suburbs to the only place that might offer temporary refuge. Megan, 5 years older than Jack, was the opposite of her brother. Where he was impulsive and outspoken, she was pragmatic and reserved, with a sharp tongue and an even sharper eye that could see right through people. She worked as a manager for a logistics company, lived in a small brick bungalow with a shabby garden, and raised two children, Luke, 10, and Sophie, 8, after divorcing her husband, who had run off with his secretary 3 years earlier. Megan didn't complain about life, but she had no illusions about it either. When Jack knocked on her door at 2 in the morning, soaking wet and smelling of whiskey, she answered without a word, just raising an eyebrow, as if she had expected something like this. "You look like a homeless person," she said, crossing her arms, her voice even but with a hint of weariness. She stood in the doorway in an old t-shirt and shorts, her blonde hair pulled back into a messy bun. "Can I stay the night?" he muttered, not looking her in the eye, his fingers nervously fiddling with the strap of his bag. Megan sighed, stepping aside. "Go ahead, but don't you dare wake the kids." And so began a new chapter in Jack's life, or rather, the lack thereof. Megan's house became his temporary home, but it didn't feel like home. The bungalow, with its cramped rooms littered with toys and school notebooks, was noisy and alive, full of an energy that Jack no longer had. He took over the old sofa in the living room, which creaked with every movement and smelled of dust. His bag of clothes remained unpacked against the wall, a reminder that he was a guest, not a resident. Megan watched him in silence for the first few days, giving him space to recover. She could see that he was broken not just by his father's death, but by the loss of his job, his marriage, and himself. His beard, now thick and unkempt, made him look like a man who hadn't looked in the mirror in a long time. His clothes, still the same pair of jeans and wrinkled t-shirts, smelled of sweat and alcohol. He had gained weight, his once toned body now felt flabby, his movements sluggish, as if each step required an incredible amount of effort. But worst of all, his eyes were hollow, veined with red, and devoid of any spark or hope. Jack spent his days on the couch, staring at a television he rarely turned on. He didn't help around the house, didn't play with his nephews, didn't try to find a job. His world had narrowed to the bottle he bought at the corner store, hiding it in a paper bag like a teenager hiding cigarettes. He drank not for pleasure, but for oblivion, each sip an attempt to drown out the voices in his head, Emily's calling him worthless, his father's memory weighing heavily on his shoulders. He drank alone when Megan was at work and the kids were at school, sitting on the porch or in the garage where no one could see him. Megan, busy with her own life, tolerated his behavior at first. She cooked dinners that Jack barely participated in, leaving plates of pasta or stew untouched. She washed his clothes when they smelled so bad that the children winced, but she didn't say anything about it, just silently stacked the clean clothes by the couch. She knew he was suffering, and she remembered what he had been like before, the little brother who made her laugh by throwing her shoes on the roof of the barn, or who fixed her car when it broke down. But her patience had its limits, And with each passing day, she saw more clearly that Jack wasn't just grieving, he was giving in. His presence in the house began to feel like a shadow, dousing the light. Luke and Sophie, curious about their uncle at first, began to avoid him, scared by his gloomy appearance and the pungent smell he brought with him. Megan noticed them whispering, asking why Uncle Jack was sad all the time. She tried to explain that he was going through a tough time, but her own irritation grew. She was working 10-hour days, raising a family on her own, paying a mortgage, and the last thing she needed was a grown man turning her living room into a bar. One evening, after a particularly long day in which she was stuck in traffic, late for Sophie's school play, and spilled coffee on her only decent blouse, Megan returned home to find Jack hunched over on the porch, a bottle of cheap rum in his hand, his gaze fixed on a crack in the concrete. A paper bag lay nearby, crumpled and wet with dew. The kids were in the living room, doing their homework, but the smell of alcohol had already seeped into the house like an uninvited guest. Megan paused in the doorway, her bag still slung over her shoulder. She looked at her brother, feeling something hot and uncontrollable boiling inside her. "Jack," she said, her voice low but firm, "this has to stop." He looked up, his eyes cloudy but with a hint of irritation in them. "Stop what? I'm just sitting here." "Don't play dumb," she snapped, stepping closer. "You drink every day. You don't work, you don't help, you don't even talk to the kids. You've turned my house into your own personal dump, and I'm tired of it." He snorted, leaning back against the step. "Your house? Fine, Megan. Want me to leave? Just say the word, and I'll be gone." She pressed her lips together, her eyes narrowing. "You think it's that easy? You think it's easy for me to watch you drink yourself to death? You're my brother, Jack, but I can't keep you here if you're not going to at least try. Either get yourself together or drink yourself to death, but not under my roof." Her words hit him like a whip, but he didn't show it. Instead, he took another sip, his movements challenging, almost brazen. "You're just like Emily," he muttered, his voice laced with bitterness. "You all think you can just snap your fingers and I'll be whoever you want me to be." Megan froze, her face pale. She took a step toward him, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Don't you dare compare me to her. Emily loved you, Jack. She fought for you until you kicked her out of your life. And me? It's not my responsibility to save you. I have 2 children to look after, and I won't let you drag us all down with you." She turned and walked into the house, slamming the door so hard the windows shook. Jack stood on the porch, his fingers clutching the bottle, his heart pounding. He wanted to shout after her, to tell her that she didn't understand, that he couldn't just pull himself together. But the truth was, he didn't know how. He felt like a car whose engine had been ripped out, still seemingly intact, but unable to move. That night he slept on the couch, but his sleep was fitful, full of fragments of memory. His father's face, Emily's laughter, the smell of the house on Maplewood Drive. Megan hadn't said a word to him in the morning, but her silence had spoken louder than any rebuke. She'd left for work, leaving a note on the kitchen table. "Food in the fridge. Don't drink in front of the kids." Jack stared at the note, shame tightening in his chest, but instead of putting the bottle away, he hid it in the garage behind boxes of Christmas decorations. The days passed slowly, each one similar to the last. Jack didn't look for a job, didn't call Emily, didn't try to mend his relationship with his sister. He existed rather than lived, his days filled with television noise, cheap alcohol, and the self-deprecation that had become his constant companion. He blamed himself for everything, for his father's death, for losing his job, for ruining his marriage. He imagined Emily moving on without him, maybe even happy, and the thought was sharper than any knife. He thought about Tom, about the way he would look at him now, with disappointment in his eyes, and it made him drink even more. Megan, despite her toughness, couldn't completely shut her brother out. She saw his pain, saw him drowning, and it tore at her heart. She remembered him coming to her after the divorce, fixing her car, taking the kids to the park so she could sleep. But he was different now, and she didn't know how to get that Jack back. She started slipping him job postings, flyers for mechanics, drivers, even movers, but he ignored them, leaving them crumpled on his desk. One afternoon, when the kids were at school and Megan had taken the day off to do her taxes, she found Jack in the garage. He was sitting in an old chair, a bottle of beer in his hand, his eyes glued to the toolbox his father had dragged from the house in Maplewood. She paused in the doorway, her hands on her hips. "Do you even realize how this looks?" she asked, her voice tired but not angry. He shrugged, not looking at her. "What difference does it make? Everything's already fallen apart." Megan shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're not a wreck, Jack. You're a person who made a choice, and you can make another one. But if you stay here, I won't let you drag us down. I have children, Jack. They deserve better." He finally looked at her, his eyes full of pain, but with a spark of something new in them, not hope, but perhaps recognition. "I don't want to be a burden," he said quietly. "I just don't know how to get out." She softened, her shoulders slumping. "Then start small. Stop drinking. Get a job, any job. Talk to someone, not me, not Emily, a professional. But do something, Jack. Because you're not living right now, you're just waiting for everything to fall apart." She walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Jack looked at the bottle in his hand, its cold glass covered in beads of condensation. For the first time in months, he wondered what would happen if he stopped. Not for Megan, not for Emily, but for himself. He wasn't ready to quit drinking, wasn't ready to get off the couch and start over. But his sister's words were stuck in his head like a splinter, and he couldn't ignore them. Megan's house, with its noise and life, was a contrast to the emptiness inside him. He could hear Sophie humming as she did her homework, Luke laughing at cartoons, Megan arguing on the phone with the suppliers. This was life, real and tangible, and somewhere deep inside Jack wanted to be a part of it. But the road back was long, and he didn't know if he had the strength to make it. For now he just sat there, clutching his father's knife in his pocket, watching the light drain from the day, leaving him in the shadows of his own ruins. In Megan's brick bungalow, where Jack found temporary refuge after Emily kicked him out, the air was thick with the smell of pumpkin pie and children's markers. But for Jack, whose life had spiraled into a pit of whiskey and self-loathing, the cozy home was more prison than refuge. He slept on a creaky couch, his days languishing in a haze of alcohol and apathy until Megan, his older sister, decided enough was enough. Megan was the family's linchpin, a woman of character forged by years of single parenting and weathering life's storms. She had been called Sergeant Major as a child, when she was the eldest and would boss Jack and their younger brother around, making them clean up their toys or do their homework. Now, at 33, she had lost none of that iron grip. With her blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun and her piercing gaze, she looked like a general about to lead her troops into battle. And Jack, drowning in his grief, was her new mission. She tolerated his presence for almost a month, watching him turn her living room into a sanctuary for his melancholy. But her patience snapped one cold evening when she returned home from work to find him on the porch, clutching a bottle of rum, his eyes as empty as the autumn sky. The children were in their rooms, but the smell of alcohol had already seeped into the house, and that was the last straw. Megan stood over him, her shadow looming like a thundercloud. "That's enough," she said, her voice as sharp as a whip. "Stop whining, Jack. You either come back for your life or drown yourself completely, but not here, not in my house." He looked up, his face twisted in a mixture of shame and defiance. "You think it's that easy? Just stop." "No, it's not," she snapped, snatching the bottle from his hand and slamming it down on the step. "But I'm not going to let you drag us all down with you. I have kids, Jack. They don't need an uncle who smells like a bar and sleeps all day. You're coming with me tomorrow, and I don't want to hear any arguments." "Where?" he asked, his voice hoarse, but with a spark of curiosity. "To a meeting," she replied without elaborating. "And if you try to escape, I'll find you and drag you back by the scruff of the neck." The next night, Megan dragged him out of the house, forcing him to put on a clean shirt and shave, even though his beard still looked like a bird's nest. She drove him to the local community center, where a 12-step support group was meeting in the basement. Jack sat in the back of her old minivan, staring out the window at the flickering streetlights, his fingers fiddling nervously with his father's switchblade, which he kept in his pocket. He didn't want to go there. The thought of sitting around strangers and talking about his problems made him feel sick. But Megan had given him no choice, and her determination was stronger than his resistance. The room was cramped, bare-walled, and filled with the smell of brewed coffee. Plastic chairs were arranged in a circle, filled with people of all ages, from a young man with tattoos on his arms to an older woman with a knitted scarf. Jack felt like an outsider, his shoulders tense, his eyes darting around the room, searching for a way out. Megan sat next to him, her presence an invisible chain holding him in place. The moderator, a middle-aged man named Paul with kind eyes and a voice laced with cigarettes, began the meeting, inviting everyone to share if they were ready. Jack was silent, his hands clutching his knees, as the others spoke of their struggles, lost families, ruined careers, years spent in the grip of addiction. Their words were like a mirror in which he saw himself reflected, and it frightened him. When it was his turn, he murmured, "I'm Jack. I'm just here because my sister made me." There was a soft laugh, but there was no judgment in it, only understanding. Megan squeezed his hand, her fingers warm and firm, and he felt something stir in him, not hope, but perhaps a desire not to disappoint her. The first few days sober were like walking on hot coals. Megan, true to her word, took him on like a recruit sergeant. She confiscated all the bottles he'd stashed in the garage and replaced them with cans of soda, which he hated. She'd wake him at 6 in the morning, make him put on his old sneakers and run around the block with her, despite his grumbling and gasping for breath. The runs were excruciating his body, heavy from months of inactivity and alcohol, protested with every step. But Megan persisted, her voice a command. "Move those legs, Jack. You're not going to die, although you might want to." She also watched him like a hawk, ready to snatch the bottle if he even thought about it. Once, when he tried to sneak off to the corner store, she caught him mid-stride, her eyes blazing with fury. "Are you serious?" she snapped, yanking the paper bag out of his hands. "I drag you to meetings, run around with you like an idiot, and you still try to hide? Stop it, Jack. Either you fight, or I'll throw you the hell out." Her words stung, but they were also what kept him from breaking down. He hated her for it, but he was grateful. Without her tough love, he would have returned to the bottle, drowning the last of his will. But sobriety had not been easy. Every day without alcohol was like a battle with himself. His hands shook in the mornings, not from the cold, but from the desire that burned inside him. At night, he lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts swirling around Emily, the house, his father. He imagined her face, her words, "You have become nothing," and felt his chest tighten with shame. The internal breakdowns were worse than the physical ones. In the support group, he listened to others' stories, but couldn't bring himself to talk. He felt like an imposter, someone who didn't deserve to be saved. At the third meeting, Paul, the leader, gently nudged him. "Jack, you don't have to tell me everything. Just say how you feel. One step at a time." Jack swallowed, his throat dry as a desert. I don't know who I am without this," he managed, referring to the whiskey, but knowing he was talking about something bigger, his life, his past. The room responded with silent sympathy, and he felt the lump in his throat shrink a little. Megan, despite her sternness, noticed these small steps. She saw him start to run a little further, without stopping to catch his breath, and he began to play basketball with Luke in the yard, albeit awkwardly. She didn't praise him, that wasn't her style, but she would sometimes leave an extra piece of pie on the table or put on an old John Wayne movie, knowing it would remind him of his father, but perhaps in a good way. One night, after a particularly grueling run, as Jack collapsed on the couch, breathing hard, his mind wandered. He remembered a conversation he had with his father many years ago, when he was 16. They had been sitting in the backyard of the house on Maplewood Drive, drinking lemonade and watching the sun set behind the oak tree. Jack had failed his algebra exam and was sure he had disappointed his father. Tom, with his rough hands and the smell of cigarettes, had looked at him and said, "Real strength, son, isn't in never falling. It's in getting up when you fall. Life will knock you down, but you've got to get up every time." The words, long forgotten, echoed in his head now. He lay on the couch, sweat trickling down his temples, and thought about how many times he'd fallen in the last few months his father's death, losing his job, leaving Emily. He hadn't gotten up then, but now, with Megan pushing him forward and a support group giving him space, he began to wonder if he still had that strength in him. Sobriety was as fragile as the first ice on a lake. On his fifth day without alcohol, he almost lost it when he found an old beer bottle behind the couch. He held it in his hands, feeling the cold glass, his fingers shaking with the desire to open it. But the image of Megan, her stern gaze, and his father's voice talking about strength stopped him. He poured the beer into the sink, watching it bubble and disappear, and felt something stir inside him, not victory, but a step toward it. Megan, returning home to find the empty bottle in the trash, said nothing, but her lips twitched in the hint of a smile. She knew it would be a long road, that Jack was not yet out of the woods, but she saw in him a glimmer of the boy who had once stolen her bike to ride around the block, and the man who had built Emily's shelves with love in his eyes. She was not going to give up, and to his own surprise, Jack was beginning to feel that maybe he wasn't ready to give up just yet. By early December, Lakewood, Ohio, was wrapped in the pre-holiday bustle, with fairy lights sparkling on the streets and the air smelling of pine and hot cocoa. At Megan's house, where Jack had found refuge after being thrown out of his home on Maplewood Drive, the atmosphere was far from festive, but there was something new brewing, a cautious, fragile hope. 2 months earlier, Megan, with her sergeant-like determination, had literally snatched her brother from the clutches of his addiction, getting him to 12-step meetings, running in the mornings, and putting down the bottle. Now, 60 days sober, Jack was beginning to resemble the man he once was, but with new scars and a determination to prove he was not the nobodies people had assumed he was. For Jack, sobriety was more than just a lack of alcohol. It was a daily battle, requiring a discipline he had never known before. The first weeks were excruciating. The trembling in his hands, the sleepless nights when his mind screamed for whiskey, the constant feeling that he was teetering on the edge of a precipice. But Megan, with her unwavering faith in him, and the meetings at the community center where he began to speak out, however reluctantly, became his anchor. He listened to the stories of others, the truck driver who had lost his family to meth, the librarian who hid vodka in a thermos and found echoes of his own struggle. By day 30, he began to feel a little lighter, as if the weight on his shoulders had become a little less overwhelming. By day 60, he could look in the mirror and see not just the shadows of the past, but a glimmer of the future. His appearance reflected the changes within. Megan had insisted that he clean up his act, and he had grumbled his way into it. He had shaved off his unkempt beard, leaving only a neat stubble that accentuated his cheekbones rather than obscured them. His hair, once greasy and tangled, had been trimmed at a local barber shop, where the older barber had chatted about baseball while Jack had remained silent, enjoying the feeling of cleanliness. Running with Megan, which had begun as torture, had become a ritual that had restored his body's strength. He had lost weight, his muscles had regained their definition, and the shirts he now ironed himself fit him like they had in the days when he had still been proud of himself. Megan, noticing his efforts, had given him a new pair of work boots, not out of sentimentality, but as a hint that it was time to move on. Work was the next step. After a month of sobriety, when Jack was beginning to feel stable enough to emerge from the cocoon of Megan's home, she thrust a newspaper ad into his hands. "You can't live on my couch forever," she said, her voice firm but warm. He swallowed his pride and began sending out resumes, even though his experience as an auto mechanic was tainted by a layoff. After a dozen rejections, he came across an ad for a small solar panel installation firm in suburban Cleveland. Green energy was on the rise, and the company needed hands willing to learn. The interview was nerve-wracking. Jack sat in a cramped office that smelled of fresh paint, facing a manager named Kevin, whose beard and tattoos made him look more like a rocker than a boss. Kevin asked a blunt question, "Why did you get fired from your last job?" Jack swallowed hard and answered honestly, "I was in a bad place, drinking, running late, but I've been sober for a month and I'm ready to work." Kevin looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "This isn't a sanitarium, but if you keep your word, I'll give you a chance." The work was hard, but rewarding. Jack spent days on rooftops installing panels in the hot sun or cold wind, his hands getting used to the new tools and his mind getting used to the rhythm of the task. His co-workers, a motley crew of former construction workers and environmental enthusiasts, were friendly but not pushy, allowing him to keep his distance. He began to appreciate the simplicity of physical labor, the sound of the drill, the weight of the panels, the smell of hot asphalt. It wasn't like fixing cars, but it gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. He got his first paycheck, modest but honestly earned. He gave Megan half of it for board, despite her protests, and for the first time in months, he felt less like a burden and more like someone who could contribute. He bought Luke and Sophie ice cream, and their delighted smiles as they ate it on the porch were a balm to his soul. Megan, watching, just chuckled, but her eyes softened. "You're starting to look like my brother," she said one night, and it was her version of praise. But beneath the surface changes, Jack was struggling internally. Sobriety hadn't erased the memories of the past few months of how he'd failed Emily, of her calling him nothing, of the rain as he left home. They haunted him, especially at night, when he'd lie on Megan's couch, listening to the house creak and the dog's bark in the distance. He missed Emily, not just her presence, but who he'd been around her. The man who built shelves, danced in the rain, dreamed of children running in the backyard. He knew he'd lost her trust, but deep down he was beginning to believe he could get it back. The idea began at a 12-step meeting, when Paul, the leader, was talking about the ninth step, making amends to those you've hurt. Jack, who had by then begun speaking at meetings, shared his story, not all of it, but enough to acknowledge how he'd ruined his marriage. "I want her back," he said one day, his voice shaking but firm. "Not just back, but to prove that I'm not the man who left, that I can be better." The room responded with silent approval, and Paul nodded. "It starts with you, Jack. Be the man she loved, and maybe she'll see you again." That goal to win Emily back became his beacon. He had no illusions that it would be easy. He didn't call or write, knowing that words meant nothing without action. Instead, he focused on becoming a man worthy of her and the home they once shared. He imagined himself returning to Maplewood Drive, not as the broken man she'd kicked out, but as someone who could keep his word. He thought of the house, its creaky floors, the yellow paint in the kitchen, the letters from his father to his mother still sitting on the coffee table. He wanted to prove himself worthy of that legacy, that love. His sobriety grew stronger every day, but not without a fight. There were times when he passed the corner bar and the smell of beer beckoned him like a siren. One day, after a hard day in which he had stripped the threads of a bolt and been scolded by Kevin, he paused in the store window, looking at the rows of bottles. His hand tightened on his father's knife in his pocket, and he remembered Tom's words from years ago in the backyard. "Real strength is in getting up when you fall." He turned and walked home, his steps heavy but determined. Megan noticed his efforts, though she was slow to praise them. She saw him getting up earlier to make coffee for her and the kids, and helping Luke with his math homework, patiently explaining fractions. She still kept him on a short leash, checking the garage for bottles and forcing him to run even on freezing mornings. But sometimes she caught herself smiling when he laughed at a joke Sophie made or fixed the squeaky bathroom door. "You're still on probation," she'd say, but her tone was lighter than before. Working on solar panels gave Jack not only an income, but also a sense of belonging. His coworkers began inviting him over for pizza after his shift, and though he initially declined, afraid of temptation, he began joining in, ordering Coke and listening to their stories. One of them, a guy named Raoul, shared his story of quitting drinking for his daughter, and it gave Jack a new perspective. He began to wonder if he could be a father, a husband, a giver as well as a taker. Jack felt not just sober, but alive. He looked at himself in Megan's bathroom mirror and saw a man he was beginning to like. His hands, calloused from working on the roofs, were proof of his labor. His body, toned again, reminded him of his runs and discipline. But most of all, his mind, still vulnerable but less clouded, was full of Emily. He imagined himself standing before her, not with empty promises, but with proof sobriety, work, determination. He didn't know if she would forgive him, but he was willing to fight for it. One night, after a meeting, he was sitting with Paul over coffee at an all-night diner. Paul, sipping black coffee, asked, "Have you thought about what you'll tell her when you're ready?" Jack paused, his fingers fiddling with the edge of a paper napkin. "I don't want to talk," he finally said. "I want to show. She deserves more than words." Paul nodded, his eyes warm. "Then keep doing what you're doing, one day at a time." Jack walked back to Megan's house, his steps light despite the cold. He lay down on the sofa, listening to the house creak in the wind, and for the first time in months, he fell asleep without thinking about whiskey. His dream of returning to Emily was still distant, but it no longer seemed impossible. He knew the road would be long, that he had to prove not only to her, but to himself that he was not a nobody. It was a cold, clear afternoon in Westlake, Ohio, with a sky that shone like polished sapphire. At 214 Maplewood Drive, the blue siding house with its white picket fence stood quietly, its windows sparkling in the winter sun. Jack, 2 months into his sobriety, his new job, and his struggle to get back to himself, felt ready to take the step that would define his future. He had spent those months picking up the pieces of his life, spurred on by the tough love of his sister Megan and the encouragement of his 12-step group. Now, with a bouquet of red roses in his hand and a speech rehearsed in front of the mirror, he stood in the doorway of the house that had once been his, ready to ask Emily for another chance. He arrived in an old pickup truck, borrowed from a coworker who worked installing solar panels. His new life was modest but honest. He had been sober for 60 days, his body had been toned back into shape by his morning runs, and his face, clean-shaven and trimmed with stubble, reflected a man who had begun to believe in himself. He wore his best shirt, a navy one that Megan had ironed, grumbling that he still didn't know how to use an iron. In his pocket was his father's switchblade, his talisman, a reminder that true strength came from getting up when you fell. The speech he had prepared was simple but heartfelt. He wanted to tell Emily that he had changed, that he was not the man she had kicked out into the rain, that he would fight for their love if she would let him. Jack stepped out of the car. The bouquet of roses he'd bought at the corner florist was cold in his hands, but their scent permeated the air. He paused at the porch, his heart pounding like a drum, not with fear, but with hope. He imagined Emily opening the door, her brown hair pulled back into a messy bun, looking at him, perhaps with surprise, perhaps with caution, but perhaps with a hint of the love they'd once shared. He took a deep breath, straightened his collar, and stepped toward the glass front door, ready to knock. But what he saw through the clear glass stopped him like a blow to the chest. On the living room couch, the same one where he and Emily had once watched movies, cuddled under a blanket, she was with another man. Their bodies were entwined, their clothes scattered on the floor, their movements full of wild, unbridled passion. Emily, her hair spilling over her shoulders, pressed herself against him, her lips moving, whispering something Jack couldn't hear. But then her words, sharp and clear, cut through the glass like a knife. "Compared to him, you're fire, and he's a pathetic nothing." Jack froze, his fingers gripping the bouquet so tightly that the thorns dug into his palm, but he felt no pain. Her words, the same ones she had thrown at him that night in the rain, echoed in his head, but now they were directed at someone else, at the man who had taken his place in his home, in his life. The anger he had suppressed for months, fighting for sobriety, for a new job, for himself, exploded inside him like a grenade. This was more than just betrayal, it was meanness, a betrayal of everything he had tried to reclaim. His mind went blank, and the last brakes holding him together snapped with a deafening crack. He dropped the bouquet, the roses scattering across the porch, their petals mixing with the snow. His hand yanked the doorknob, and he burst into the living room like a storm. Emily screamed, backing away from the man, her eyes widening in shock as she saw Jack. The man, tall, with short blonde hair and a tattoo on his forearm, tried to stand, but he was too late. Jack, his rage like hot metal, punched him in the jaw, putting all the pain, all the humiliation, everything that had been building up inside him for months into the blow. The man collapsed to the floor, his face twisted in pain, blood pouring from his split lip. "You son of a bitch," Jack growled, his voice shaking with anger. He grabbed the man by the hair, pulling him toward the door, ignoring Emily's screams. "Get out of my house, scum." Emily jumped up, her hands trying to pull Jack away. "Stop it, Jack, stop," she screamed, but he didn't hear. His world had narrowed to this moment, to this man who had desecrated his home, his love. The man, still stunned, tried to fight back, but Jack was stronger, fueled by a rage that knew no bounds. He dragged him across the living room, threw open the front door, and threw him onto the lawn, naked in the snow. The man fell, his skin instantly covered in goosebumps from the cold, his face contorted in horror and humiliation. "Grab your stuff and get out," Jack barked, throwing his scattered clothes after him, jeans, shirt, boots. They landed in the snow next to the man, who muttered curses and began to dress frantically, his fingers shaking from the cold and shock. Jack turned to Emily, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched. She was standing in the living room, a t-shirt pulled on hastily, her face a mix of fear, anger, and shame. "How dare you?" she breathed, her voice shaking. "You have no right to barge in here like a savage." "No right?" His voice was low, almost a growl. "This is my house, Emily, mine, and you're having sex with some bastard on our couch and calling me a loser. Do you even realize what you've done?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away. "You left, Jack. You chose the bottle, not me. I waited, I fought, but you just disappeared. I couldn't live in this hell anymore." Her words hit him, but not like before. They didn't make him retreat, didn't make him feel guilty. Instead, they added fuel to his rage. "I fought, Emily," he said, his voice rough but firm. "I've been sober for 2 months. I got a job. I came here with flowers to tell you I've changed, that I want us back. And you stabbed me in the back." She opened her mouth to reply, but the words stuck. She looked at the scattered rose petals on the porch, at his pained face, and something in her broke. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You didn't call, you didn't write. I thought you were gone forever. And you just jumped into bed with the first guy you came across." His words were cruel, and he knew it, but he couldn't stop himself. "You called him fire and me a piece of crap. Do you even know how that sounds?" Emily covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. "I didn't mean to. I was angry, alone. I was wrong, Jack. But you broke me too." He looked at her, his anger fading, replaced by emptiness. He wanted to hold her, to tell her they could fix this, but the image of her with another man, her words, still burned like acid. He shook his head, his voice quieter. "I don't know what to do next, Emily, but I can't stay here. Not after this." He turned and walked out without looking back. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he walked to the truck, his hands shaking, but not from the cold. He climbed behind the wheel, his fingers tightening around the switchblade in his pocket, and for the first time in months, he felt like he might lose it. He wanted to find a bar, drown this pain in whiskey, forget it all, her words, her betrayal, his humiliation. But instead, he started the engine and drove away, his mind a mess, but somewhere deep inside, a spark burning that kept him from turning toward the store. He returned to Megan's house, his face pale and his eyes empty. She was in the kitchen, mixing dough for Christmas cookies, when he walked in. One look at him, and she knew something was wrong. "What's wrong?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. He collapsed into a chair, his voice hollow. "I went to Emily, wanted to, wanted to fix everything, but she was with someone else. Called me a loser, said he was better." Megan froze, her eyes narrowing. "Damn it," she breathed, her voice full of anger, but not at Jack. She had no right. But you, what did you do? He told her everything about the flowers, what he'd seen, how he'd thrown the guy onto the lawn. Megan listened, her face unreadable, but when he'd finished, she came over and put her hand on his shoulder. You were an idiot, but I don't blame you. She crossed a line. But listen to me, Jack. You're sober, you have a job, you're starting to get back on your feet. Don't let her take that away from you. He nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of home, of how he'd once dreamed of children running around the yard, of nights with Emily laughing at silly movies. Now that home was tarnished, as were his hopes. But Megan's words, her unwavering faith in him, were like an anchor. He knew he wouldn't go back to the bottle not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't let himself go back to being the man Emily had called a loser. That night, he lay on the couch, listening to the wind pound the windows, and thought about his father. He remembered Tom telling him once, after yet another fight with his mother, "Love isn't just about the good times, son. It's choosing to keep going when everything falls apart." Jack didn't know if he could continue to love Emily after this, but he knew he wanted to continue to love himself, the person he had begun to rebuild. He clutched his father's knife in his hand and promised himself that he wouldn't let this pain define him. It was late December in Westlake, Ohio, and a cold wind was blowing wisps of snow down Maplewood Drive. The blue siding and white picket fence, once a symbol of Jack and Emily's love, was now the scene of their broken marriage. An hour earlier, Jack had driven in, full of hope and holding a bouquet of roses, to beg his wife for another chance. Instead, he had found her with another man, and her words, "You're fire compared to him, and he's a pathetic nobody," had cut him like a dagger. The rage that had erupted had led him to throw him naked onto the lawn, but the pain of Emily's betrayal had not subsided. It was growing like a fire, eating him from the inside out, and now he had returned to the house to sever the last ties that bound them together. Jack walked into the living room, his boots leaving wet marks on the wooden floor. Emily was sitting on the couch, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She looked at him, her lips trembling, but she didn't say a word. Their recent argument, his accusations, her excuses hung in the air like smoke. He couldn't listen to her anymore, couldn't bear to see her in this house that had once been their refuge. His gaze fell on the scattered rose petals on the porch, and something in him finally broke. He didn't want to make peace, didn't want to forgive. He wanted to erase her from this house, from his life. "You don't live here anymore," he said, his voice as cold as the winter wind. "Pack your things and go." Emily jumped up, her hands clenched into fists. "You can't just kick me out, Jack. This is my house, too. We're married, damn it." "Married?" he snorted, his eyes flashing with anger. "You had sex with some asshole on our couch, Emily. You called me a loser. What the hell kind of marriage is that? You ruined it." She opened her mouth to protest, but the words stuck. Her shoulders slumped and she turned away, her face a mixture of shame and despair. Jack didn't wait for her to answer. He headed for the stairs, his steps heavy, determined. He knew what he was doing, knew it was irreversible, but at that moment he didn't care. He wanted her to feel the same pain that was tearing him apart. In their bedroom, the room where they had once whispered about the future, laughed at silly jokes, made love to the sound of summer rain, he began gathering up her things. He yanked open the closet doors, pulling out the designer dresses she loved so much. The sea green silk dress she'd worn to her friend's wedding, the backless black dress she'd bought for their anniversary. He threw them on the floor, not caring if the fabric creased or tore. Then he grabbed her shoes, the collection of pumps and sandals she'd treasured, and threw them into the pile. His hands moved quickly, fueled by a rage that wouldn't let him stop. In a dresser drawer, he found their wedding album, its white leather cover coated in a thin layer of dust. He froze, his fingers brushing the album, and for a moment images flashed before his eyes. Emily glowing in her lace dress, their dance under the stars, her laugh as he smeared cake on her cheek. But the memories were poisoned by her words, her betrayal. He clutched the album, his knuckles white, and tossed it on top of the pile of clothes as if throwing away a ghost. Gathering up everything he could carry, He lugged the pile downstairs, dragging dresses and shoes along the stairs. Emily stood in the living room, her eyes widening as she saw what he was doing. "Jack, stop it," she screamed, rushing toward him. "You can't just." "I can," he snapped, his voice a blow. "You're not part of this house anymore, and you're not part of me." He dragged the clothes out onto the driveway, where the snow was already beginning to melt in the weak rays of the sun. The pile of dresses and shoes and an album looked out of place on the neat lawn, like trash thrown out after a cleanup. But Jack didn't stop. He went back into the garage, where he found a can of gasoline from his father's old lawn mower. His mind was clouded, but his actions were clear, as if he were following some ancient instinct. He poured the gasoline on the pile, its sharp smell mixing with the cold air, and pulled a lighter from his pocket. Emily ran out onto the porch, her face twisted in horror. "Jack, no. Are you crazy? These are my things, our memories." He looked at her, his eyes empty, but with a fire she had never seen before. "There is no more room for lies here," he said, his voice low, almost ritualistic. He flicked the lighter, and the flames burst into flame, licking the gasoline. The pile of clothes caught fire instantly, tongues of fire shooting up, devouring silk and leather and paper. The wedding album smoldered, the photographs of them smiling and dancing curling into black ash. "You're a traitor," Jack shouted, his voice echoing through the street like thunder. "This is my home, mine, do you hear? You don't deserve it." Emily froze, her hands clasped to her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. She watched her things burn, their past go up in smoke, and she couldn't move. "You're a monster," she whispered, but her words were lost in the crackling fire. Neighbors, drawn by the smoke and the screams, began to come out into the street. Mrs. Carter, the elderly woman across the street, stood on her porch, her robe flapping in the wind, her eyes wide. The young Davises, who lived 2 doors down, peered out their window, their toddler pressed against the glass. Mr. Rogers, a former firefighter, was already dialing 911, his voice shaking with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Westlake was a quiet suburb where the biggest event was usually a parking dispute, and this was a rupture in their quiet lives. "What's up with the Wilsons?" neighbors whispered, gathering on the sidewalks. "Is that Jack?" He went back. "They say she was having an affair. That's what drove him crazy." Rumors flew around the block like sparks from a fire, fueled by curiosity and condemnation. By the time the fire alarm wailed in the distance, the story of the turbulent family down the block had already begun to take shape. Some said Jack had attacked Emily's lover with a knife. Others claimed she had been cheating on him for years. Jack stood by the burning pile, his face illuminated by orange light, his chest heaving with heavy breathing. He didn't feel the cold, didn't hear Emily's screams, didn't notice his neighbors. His world had narrowed to this fire, which seemed to cleanse him of pain, of betrayal, of love that had become poison. But somewhere in the back of his mind, behind the curtain of anger, a thought flashed. What have I done? Emily, still on the porch, sank to her knees, her hands shaking. She watched their wedding album burn, the pictures of their first dance, their vows, their dreams, turning to ash. She wanted to hate Jack for it, but part of her felt guilty for her words, for her actions, for letting their marriage get to this point. "Why didn't you stop?" she whispered, but the words were as much for herself as for him. The fire truck arrived a few minutes later, its red lights flashing in the gathering dusk. The firemen, in heavy yellow jackets, quickly put out the flames, leaving only a smoking pile of charred stuff. One of them, a young man with a stern face, approached Jack. "Sir, what happened here? Is this your house?" Jack nodded, his voice hoarse. "Mine. It was needed." The fireman frowned but didn't argue. He wrote down the name and walked over to his partner, who was already talking to the police who had arrived behind him. The officer, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, approached Jack. "Mr. Wilson, we need to talk. Do you realize that arson is a misdemeanor?" Jack looked at her, his anger beginning to fade, replaced by emptiness. "I understand. Do what you have to do." Emily, still sitting on the porch, looked up, her eyes meeting him. There was no hatred in them, only endless weariness. "Are you satisfied?" she asked quietly. "Is it over now?" He didn't answer. He didn't know if he was satisfied, didn't know if it was over. He only knew that the house he had once considered his now seemed as foreign as the woman standing before him. The neighbors were still milling about in the street, their whispers humming like a swarm of bees. Mrs. Carter was already calling her sister in the next town, telling her how Jack Wilson went crazy and burned everything on the lawn. The Davises were debating whether to move to a neighborhood where there's no drama like this. Mr. Rogers, sipping coffee on his porch, shook his head, muttering, "I feel sorry for the guy, but he's got himself into a corner." The policewoman pulled Jack aside, asking him questions about what had happened, writing his answers in a notebook. He spoke calmly, almost mechanically, telling how he had found Emily with another man, how he had packed up her things, how he had set them on fire. He did not mention his sobriety, the 2 months he had spent rebuilding himself, the hope that had brought him here with the flowers. It seemed distant now, like someone else's life. Emily refused to file a report, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't want him in jail," she told the officer. "I just want this to be over." The officer nodded, but warned Jack that the incident would be recorded and advised him to stay out of trouble. When the police and firefighters left, the street was empty, but the rumors continued to spread like wildfire. By morning, all of Westlake knew about Crazy Jack, who burned his wife's things, and Emily, who was cheating on him with some guy. Their story became local legend, the stuff of gossip over coffee and at school assemblies. Jack got back into the truck, his hands shaking as he started the engine. He looked at the house one last time, at the smoking pile on the lawn, at Emily standing on the porch, her silhouette alone in the streetlight. He didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if he could ever forgive her or himself. But he knew he wouldn't go back to the bottle, not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't let himself go back to being the man she'd rejected. He drove back to Megan, his thoughts like the charred remains of his past. The house on Maplewood Drive, once full of dreams, was now just ashes in his heart. But somewhere in that emptiness, a spark smoldered not of love, not of hope, but of a stubborn determination to live on no matter what. Winter was gathering strength in Westlake, Ohio, blanketing Maplewood Drive in a thin layer of snow that crunched underfoot and muffled the sounds of suburbia. The blue siding, white picket house where Jack and Emily had once dreamed of a future was now a symbol of their broken marriage. After a scandal in which Jack burned Emily's belongings in the driveway, accusing her of betrayal, their story had become local legend, fueling neighbor gossip and coffee shop whispers. Jack returned to his sister Megan's house, his heart devastated but his resolve to stay sober unwavering. Emily, who remained in the house, struggled with guilt and anger, but her actions soon led to a new twist that would change their lives forever. A few days after the arson, with smoke still in the air and neighbors still peering over their fences, Emily took the plunge. She sat at the kitchen table, her fingers fiddling with her empty coffee mug, her phone in front of her. Her reputation in Westlake was in tatters. Whispers of her infidelity, of the lawn disgrace, of Crazy Jack haunted her like shadows. She felt cornered, but she was not about to give in. Her anger at Jack for his rage, for the public humiliation, for destroying their past in a fire was mixed with a pragmatic determination to protect her future. She dialed a lawyer recommended by a friend and filed for divorce, asking for half of their assets, including the house she believed they shared. Emily met with the lawyer, a woman named Linda Carver, in her office in downtown Cleveland. Linda, with her sharp suit and piercing eyes, listened to Emily's story. Their marriage, his alcoholism, her loneliness, her mistake with another man, the arson scandal. Emily made no bones about her guilt, but she insisted she was entitled to a share. "We're married," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "The house is ours together. I put soul, paint, time into it. I'm not leaving empty-handed." Linda nodded, her pen sliding across her pad. "In Ohio, property is divided equitably," she explained. "Given your contributions and circumstances, you might get half the house or its value. but we'll need to check the title deeds. If Jack inherited the house, that could complicate things. Emily frowned, her fingers tightening around her purse. Inherited. His father gave us the house on our wedding day. It was our house. Linda peered at her over her glasses. Gifts and inheritances are considered separate property in Ohio, unless they're legally transferred to both spouses. We need to get the details of his father's will straight. Emily nodded, but a tremor of worry began to form in her chest. She remembered the day of their wedding, when Tom, Jack's father, had handed them the keys, bourbon in his hand and pride in his eyes. She hadn't thought about the papers, the wills. They hadn't seemed important then. Now her future depended on these details. Meanwhile, Jack was living with Megan, his days filled with work installing solar panels and 12-step meetings. He held on to sobriety like a lifeline, despite the pain of Emily's betrayal. The scene in the living room, her with another man, her words about him being nothing, haunted him, but he refused to let it define his life. Megan, with her stern support, kept him from falling apart, forcing him to run in the mornings and help the kids with their homework. His co-workers, especially Raoul, became like a new family, their stories and after-shift pizza helping him feel like he was part of something bigger. But when he received a divorce notice a week after the arson, his world was rocked again. He sat in Megan's kitchen, holding a letter from Emily's lawyer, his fingers shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "She wants half the house," he said, his voice hollow. "After everything she's done, she wants to take back what my father left me." Megan turned to him, her eyes narrowed as she stood over the stove frying pancakes. "She's serious? After she cuckolded you and made this circus happen? Shit, Jack, you need a lawyer. Now." Jack nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He remembered his father, his rough hands building this house for his mother, his words, "This is your home now, son. Build something good in it." The thought of Emily taking half of it was unbearable. He contacted a lawyer recommended by Kevin, his boss, an older man named Marvin Gross, whose practice in Cleveland specialized in family law. Marvin, with his bushy eyebrows and the smell of menthol candies, listened to Jack's story and immediately asked, "Was the house inherited? Is there a will?" Jack nodded. "My father left it to me. He died in the summer, but the will was made before we got married." Marvin smiled, his eyes twinkling. "That changes things. If the house is in your name alone, she has no right to it, even if you're married. Bring me the will, and we'll sort this out." The trial was scheduled for a week later in Cleveland County Court. Jack, dressed in the dark suit Megan had made him buy, sat next to Marvin, his hands fiddling nervously with his father's switchblade in his pocket. Across the table, Emily sat with Linda, her face pale but determined. She avoided his gaze, her fingers clutching the handle of her purse as if that would keep her from falling. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, and smelled of old paper, but the tension in it was palpable, like before a thunderstorm. The judge, a middle-aged woman with short gray hair and a stern expression, began the hearing by asking the lawyers to state their cases. Linda spoke first, her voice clear and confident. She described Emily's contributions to the house, the renovations, the decor, her emotional attachment, and argued that, as a spouse, she was entitled to half the property. She acknowledged Emily's infidelity, but insisted that did not invalidate her rights. "My client was abandoned at a difficult time," Linda said. "Her husband suffered from alcoholism, which led to the separation. She deserves justice." Marvin, when it was his turn, was laconic, but his words were hammer blows. He produced Tom Wilson's will, drawn up a year before Jack and Emily's marriage, which clearly listed the house on Maplewood Drive as Jack's. "My client inherited the house before the marriage," Marvin said, his voice calm but firm. "It was not transferred to either spouse, and under Ohio law, it remains his separate property. Mrs. Wilson has no claim to it." Emily paled, her eyes flickering to Linda, who frowned but quickly composed herself. Linda attempted to object, arguing that Emily had invested heavily in the house, but Marvin countered by pointing out that there was no documentation of her financial contribution. The judge, who had been listening attentively, asked for a copy of the will and retired to study it. When she returned, her decision was clear. According to the paperwork, the house on Maplewood Drive is Mr. Wilson's separate property, she said, her voice level. Mrs. Wilson has no right to a share of it. The divorce will be finalized, and the property will remain Mr. Wilson's. Emily closed her eyes, her face contorted as if she were holding back a scream. Linda put her hand on her shoulder, but it did nothing to soften the blow. Emily had not only lost her home, but also the roof over her head. Her reputation in Westlake had already been destroyed by the rumors that had spread since the arson, and now she was left with nothing, no marriage, no home, no future she had once imagined. Jack looked at her, his heart aching, not with pity, but with weariness. He felt no triumph, no joy. He had a home, but at what cost? The home that had been filled with memories of their love was now soaked in pain, betrayal, and ash. He stood, thanked Marvin, and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the hallway. Outside, where the snow was falling in soft flakes, he paused, breathing in the cold air. Megan was waiting for him by the car, her arms crossed but her eyes shining with pride. "You did it," she said, her voice warm. "The house is yours. Now what?" He shrugged, his gaze distant. "I don't know. Maybe I'll start over." Emily emerged from the courthouse a few minutes later, her coat draped over her shoulders, her eyes empty. She paused on the sidewalk, looking out at the snowy street as if trying to figure out where to go. Her friend Sarah, a teacher at school, had taken her in, but it was a temporary solution. Westlake, with its gossip and judgment, was no longer her home. She knew that rumors of her infidelity, of arson, of divorce, would follow her like a shadow. She had been wrong, and now she was paying a price that was higher than she could have imagined. Jack returned to Megan's house, his thoughts heavy but clear. He was sober, he had a job, and he had a home now, not just walls, but his father's legacy to protect. He thought about going back to Maplewood Drive, but he knew he wasn't ready. The house was his, but it was still full of ghosts, their laughter, their fights, her betrayal. He decided to stay with Megan for now, give himself time to heal before starting a new chapter. That evening, he went to a 12-step meeting, where he shared his story, not all of it, but enough to ease his soul. He talked about the divorce, about the house, about the pain that still lingered within him. Paul, the leader, nodded, his eyes full of understanding. "You're holding on, Jack," he said. "That's strength. Not winning, but keeping going." Jack came home late, his steps light despite his fatigue. He lay on the couch, listening to Luke and Sophie whispering in their room, Megan rattling dishes in the kitchen. He clutched his father's pocket knife, feeling its cold metal, and thought of Tom's words, "Build something good out of it." He didn't know what that would be, but for the first time in months, he felt like he had a chance to try. Westlake moved on with his life, the rumors of the turbulent family gradually dying down, replaced by new gossip. The house on Maplewood Drive stood empty, its windows dark in the winter night, but it was waiting for its owner. Jack, now free from his marriage, but not from his past, knew that he would return there when he was ready. Not for Emily, not for his father, but for himself, a man who had learned to get up after falling. Winter in Westlake, Ohio, slowly gave way to spring, and by late December 2025, the house at 214 Maplewood Drive stood silent, its blue siding slightly faded by the snow, its windows reflecting the emptiness within. Jack, now the sole owner of the house after his divorce from Emily, had returned a week after the trial, leaving behind a cozy but temporary home with his sister Megan. The court ruling that the house belonged to him under his father's will was a victory, but a bittersweet one. The house that had once been full of laughter and dreams was now cold and alien, steeped in memories of love, betrayal, and the ashes of their wedding photographs. Jack stood in the doorway, his breath curling in the frosty air, and felt the loneliness embrace him like an old friend. He walked in, the creak of his boots echoing in the empty living room. The couch where he'd found Emily with another man was still by the window, but it felt like furniture now, not a symbol of pain. Jack dropped his bag to the floor, his gaze sweeping around the room. The fireplace where he and Emily had warmed themselves during their first winter, the coffee table where his father's letters to his mother lay, the kitchen where she'd sung while cooking dinner. Everything was familiar, but distant, like scenes from an old movie. He knew it wouldn't be easy to return here, but this was his home, his father's legacy, and he was determined to fight for it, just as he'd fought for his sobriety. The first days in the house were tough. Jack slept on a mattress in the old bedroom, hesitant to take their old bed, which was now under a tarp in the garage. The silence of the house was deafening, broken only by the creaking of branches outside the window and the hum of the refrigerator. He felt like an intruder in someone else's life, but he knew this was his chance to start over. His sobriety, now 70 days old, was fragile but strong, like a young oak tree taking root in rocky soil. He went to 12-step meetings 3 times a week, worked installing solar panels, where his hands found solace in the physical labor, and ran in the mornings, continuing the habit Megan had instilled in him. But the evenings, when he returned to an empty house, were a challenge. Jack's emotional recovery was like rebuilding an old engine, slow, painstaking, with moments when he wanted to quit. He missed Emily, not the one who had betrayed him, but the one who had loved him when he was better. He blamed himself for pushing their marriage to the brink, for the months he'd spent in the bottle, for the pain he'd caused her. But he was also learning to forgive not her, but himself. At the meetings, Paul, the leader, would say, "You can't change the past, but you can build the future." Jack held on to those words like a life preserver and began looking for ways to bring life back to the house. One evening, sitting by the fire with a cup of coffee, he pulled out a box of his father's things that he'd brought from Megan's house. There were old photographs, Tom's Army medal, his notebook with its dog-eared pages. Jack sorted through them, his fingers brushing the faded images, and memories came flooding back like a warm wave. He remembered the summer he was 10, painting this house with his father. Tom stood on the ladder, his shirt soaked with sweat, a cigarette in his mouth. "This house isn't just walls, son," he'd said, waving a paintbrush. "This is where you build your story. Hold on tight." Jack, a boy then, hadn't understood the depth of those words, but now they sounded like a testament. Another memory came when Jack found a photograph of Tom in uniform, taken before he was sent to Vietnam. He was 16, and they were sitting in the garage where Tom was fixing an old motorcycle. Jack had failed his test and was afraid his father would be disappointed. Tom, wiping his hands on a rag, looked at him and said, "Strength isn't in always winning. It's in not being afraid to start over. This house is my second chance after the war, after everything. Make it yours." Those words, spoken with a husky laugh, were now like a beacon guiding Jack's way. He decided to honor his father by giving the house its soul. The next day, he went to a local frame shop and chose a simple wooden one to highlight a photo of Tom smiling against an oak tree in the yard. Jack hung it above the fireplace, carefully hammering a nail into it, and stepped back, looking at the picture. "I won't let you down, Dad," he whispered, his voice shaking but determined. The picture was more than just decoration. It was a reminder of where it all began and where it might have ended if he hadn't chosen sobriety. Jack spent the next few months rebuilding his home and himself. He started small. He washed the windows, vacuumed the carpets, threw out the old sofa, replacing it with a new one he bought at a garage sale. He repainted the kitchen, choosing a warm cream shade instead of the yellow that reminded him of Emily. Each action felt like a step toward healing, a way to regain control of his life. He worked on the house in the evenings, after shifts on rooftops installing solar panels, and his hands, calloused from the labor, found joy in sanding wood and driving screws. Flashbacks to Tom came unexpectedly, like a warm breeze on a cold day. Once, while fixing a leaky faucet, Jack remembered his father teaching him how to hold a wrench when he was 12. They were tinkering in the basement, Tom humming an old Frank Sinatra song, and Jack laughing at his off-key voice. "This house is like life, son," Tom said, tightening a bolt. "Sometimes it leaks, sometimes it squeaks, but if you take care of it, it will last forever." Jack smiled, feeling the warmth of the memory warm him, and finished the repair, imagining his father nodding in approval. By spring, the house was coming to life. Jack, inspired by his work, had arranged with his boss, Kevin, to install solar panels on the roof. They were his gift to the house, a symbol of his new life built on hard work and sustainability. The panels sparkled in the sun, their smooth surfaces reflecting the sky, and Jack, standing on the lawn, felt a pride he hadn't felt in years. He had also begun renovating the exterior, stripping away old paint and applying a fresh coat of blue, the same shade his father had chosen decades earlier. Neighbors who had once whispered about the turbulent family now looked on curiously, some even waving, as he took in his work. Jack's emotional recovery went hand in hand with his physical. He continued to attend meetings where he now spoke openly, sharing not only his pain but his triumphs. He talked about the house, about how he was giving it life back, and about Tom, whose memory was his compass. Paul, the leader, once said, "You're not just building a house, Jack. You're building yourself." The words sank in, and he began to see every nail, every stroke of paint, as a step toward becoming a man worthy of the house. By the summer of 2026, 6 months after his return, the house had been transformed. The exterior gleamed with a fresh coat of paint, the solar panels hummed with energy, and the lawn, once littered with the ashes of Emily's belongings, was now neatly trimmed. Jack had built the deck with a wooden deck and barbecue area that he had dreamed of with Emily. He worked on it on weekends, his hands finding comfort in the smell of freshly cut wood and the sound of a hammer. The deck was his way of telling the world and himself that he was not broken, that he was ready to move on. In June, as the heat began to settle over Westlake, Jack decided to throw a barbecue, the first in years, and invite friends and neighbors. He felt ready to open up the house, to show that it was no longer a place of scandal and pain, but his father's home, full of pride and memory. He sent out invitations to Megan and the kids, to his co-workers, to Raoul and Kevin, even to the neighbors who had once gossiped about him. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Rogers, the Davis family all received handwritten cards with a simple message: "Come to the barbecue. Let's start over." The day of the barbecue was warm, with a light breeze carrying the scent of maple blossoms. The porch was decorated with fairy lights, and the tables were laden with food: ribs, corn on the cob, potato salad that Megan had made, grumbling that Jack still can't cook. The music was blasting the old rock that Tom loved, and the laughter of friends and neighbors filled the air. Luke and Sophie ran around the yard, playing with the neighborhood kids, and Megan, sipping lemonade, watched her brother with a small smile. Jack stood by the grill, his face glistening from the heat, but his eyes shining. He looked out at the people filling his house and felt something inside him healing. Raoul clapped him on the shoulder, handing him a bottle of soda. "Nice house, bro," he said, and Jack smiled, accepting praise without shame for the first time. Mrs. Carter, who had once whispered about his crazy, now complimented his porch, and Mr. Rogers, the ex-fireman, winked and said, "You did well, man. Not everyone can get up from that." That evening, as the guests began to leave, Jack stayed on the veranda, looking at the stars that were beginning to appear in the sky. Megan came up to him, her hands in the pockets of her jeans. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly, the rare words she didn't throw around. Jack nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said, and she snorted, but her eyes were warm. Before going to bed, he walked into the living room, where the fire was glowing softly. He picked up the photograph of his father that was already hanging above the mantel and carefully nailed it to the stonework, making sure it was secure. It was a ritual, an end to his journey, or rather, a new beginning. Tom, smiling in the picture, was his reminder of where it all began. A home built with love, a father who believed in him, a fall that could have been the end, but was instead the beginning. Jack stepped back, looking at the photograph, and felt the weight of the past lighten. He had not forgotten Emily, he had not forgotten the pain, but he knew now that he could live with her, as a scar that made him stronger. The house on Maplewood Drive, now gleaming with new color and energy, was more than just walls. It was his second chance, his story, his legacy. And Jack, standing in the quiet of the living room, promised himself and his father that he would make it worthy. Thank you for listening to the end. If you like this story, please support it with a like and a comment. It really inspires us to create new episodes. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. It will definitely surprise you. See you soon, and may your life be filled with more good stories. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.